8 billion people and counting. Planet Earth reaches a milestone. What are the challenges of a growing population and the impact on sustainability? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. In just 12 years, the global population increased from 7 billion to 8 billion people. The United Nations says people are living longer thanks to improvements in public health and medicine. But the growth also comes from high fertility rates in the world's poorest countries. The sheer number of people alone isn't an issue, but overconsumption of resources by the world's wealthiest is hurting the planet.
Too often, population growth is conflated with a rise in greenhouse gas emissions, and that ignores the fact that countries with the highest level of consumption and emissions are those where population growth is slow or even negative. Meanwhile, the majority of the world population growth is and will increasingly be concentrated among the world's poorest countries. These countries, which have significantly lower emission rates, are likely to suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change, in part because they lack the resources needed to adapt to these changes and to mitigate their impacts.
For more on the global population, let's bring in our panel here in Washington, D.C. Kathleen Boglegard is the president and CEO of the Population Institute. Also in Washington, Chidanand Rajgatha is the foreign editor and U.S. bureau chief at the Times of India newspaper. Chen is an associate professor of health policy and economics at Yale University in Connecticut. And John Wilmoth is the director of the population division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. He is joining us from New York. And John, why don't we start with you? You just heard your colleague talking about this dichotomy. You see these wealthier countries where population growth not really an issue, but consumption emissions really are, and it's really having an impact on these poorer countries. How is this impacting climate and sustainable development goals?
Well, it's quite significant in terms, as you point out, most of the emissions are coming from countries that have relatively low rates of population growth. And we've seen this historically. Of course, that's slowly changing as countries develop. They will begin also to contribute to the global emissions. But historically, most of those emissions that are causing climate change today have come from countries that are relatively wealthy now and whose populations are not growing.
And John, we just saw leaders at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh approve this global fund to provide assistance to some of these poor nations. We've seen them just really ravaged by the impacts of climate change. How significant is this?
Well, it's quite a significant agreement. It was a kind of groundbreaking decision to do this, to establish a new funding arrangement and a dedicated fund that will assist developing countries in responding to loss and damage that's related to climate change. It's still in the process of being set up. For now, all there is an agreement to establish the funding mechanism, and the design of that has been left for a committee to work out. A regionally balanced committee of 24 members will work on this, and then hopefully the details will be adopted next year at COP28.
Kathleen, in addition to being vulnerable to climate change, many of these poor countries are experiencing high population rates as well. Can you talk to us about that, and what's the significance of that?
This is hugely significant. Many of the countries that are most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change are experiencing rapid population growth. And this is a factor that will exacerbate climate change vulnerability in the years to come. So I think it's really critical that we understand what the demographic trends are in the countries that are most vulnerable to impacts of climate change, and to think about the ways in which we can be increasing the adaptive capacity and the resilience of people in those communities. And a lot of those kinds of investments are ones that will be good for people and also may put the brakes on population growth, thereby reduce the overall scale of human vulnerability to climate change impacts in those places.
Kathleen, I know you talk about this quite a bit. I wanted to get my numbers right before I came on the air, and hopefully they're right. If they're not, correct me. But I was looking, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10,000 people being born each hour. That's every hour, every day. So by the end of this broadcast, it's going to be about 5,000. And this just keeps going and going and going. So the size keeps growing. growing. I remember talking to an expert on this back in 2018. She said it's one of the biggest crises of our time, but because it's not just the crisis itself, but because of how deeply it is ignored. And I know you talk about it. How frustrating is that for you, and do you agree with her?
It is frustrating that there is not as much talk about population trends and their implications for society as there once was. I think we all appreciate that population dynamics do have significant implications for society. And what we were just talking about in terms of growing human vulnerability to the impacts of climate change is one of those dimensions. I think what is also really critical to understand is that rapid population growth often is a symptom of a lack of investment in the health and well-being and rights of women and girls. So for me, the day of 8 billion is an opportunity for us to reflect on where we haven't finished the job of ensuring gender equity, access to reproductive health care and family planning services, and education for girls. These are the kinds of investments that are really good for individuals, really good for society, and also will have the effect of lowering fertility over the long term and putting the brakes on population growth.
All right, tease that out for us. Why is that?
Why is it that when we have these kinds of investments that we see reductions in fertility? I think it's pretty easy to understand. As we are looking at the kinds of trends, particularly around gender inequity, often what we see in places that are experiencing very rapid population growth is that girls are getting married before they're even adults. This means that they begin to have children very early in life, and then they have, over their reproductive lifespan, 7, 8, or maybe 9 children. This is something that continues to drive rapid population growth. That also means that they don't have an opportunity to complete their education, to enter the workforce, and may not have access, meaningful access to the comprehensive reproductive health and family planning services that would enable them to have reproductive autonomy in their lives. So there's a whole suite of connected investments that mutually reinforce one another that can help to expand gender equity, empower women, and really have, as I said, the effect of putting the brakes on population growth over the long term.
Chen, let's talk about putting the brakes on population growth, because when you look at China, it's a huge population, 1.4 billion. But for a long time, couples were limited to one child, the one-child policy. That's changed over recent years. Now, in some cases, you can have as many as 3 children. Talk to us about how that's been embraced. What's been the change in China, and how is that policy kind of impacting things?
Yeah, China has been gradually releasing its family planning policy, but we still say China's fertility rate is declining from very early, like 6 live births per woman, to 1.6 by 2017. Even after China released to allowing having second and third child, it's still declining. It cannot offset the general trend of decline the fertility around the world. I think a major issue is how to reduce the burden of having children, and so create a fertility-friendly society, especially for women. We know that their cost of having a baby is too huge for them. Like, for example, to their career, to their and the lack of gender equity at home put more pressure on them to having more burden. And also the economic burden to the whole family is a large issue. We know the booming housing price and the extended and the education cost is very high. China could adopt many policies that being implemented in the rest of part of the world. For example, further extending the compulsory education to allow to having children have a higher and a higher quality of education, which may bring down the cost of education and also the housing subsidy. And another thing is about very early age child care, which is not a big market in China. It's absent in much part of China, actually. So how to encourage building such facilities, nursery care, 0 to 3 age child care, where release much of the burden of the young mothers who are also in the labor market.
Yeah, it's so interesting looking at all the tentacles and the different directions it goes in. Chittanon, let's talk about India. It's expected to surpass China, I think, next year, according to the United Nations, as the world's largest population, and also talking about the neighborhood of 1.4 billion people. How is overpopulation impacting India at this stage?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious now, and it's acknowledged that the real crisis is not population. The real crisis is consumption. Both in your introduction and previous panelists spoke about this, but we did not adequately address. India has a population problem, but it's predictable. We know now that India's population is decelerating, that replacement fertility rates in India is going down. In the last 5 years, it's down from 2.2% to something like 2%. Also predictable, we know India's population will peak around 2048. And we know that the global population itself will peak. We're talking of 9.7 billion by 2064, and by 2100, it's back to 8.7 billion. So there's a downward curve. But nobody talks about consumption. Do we know if consumption will go down? And to me, that is the real crisis here. The entire global economy, which is premised on consumption and consumerism, and nobody talks about bringing that down. I think there was a brief address to this. The wealthiest 10% of the world accounts for 50% of emissions, whereas 50% of the poorest account for 10% of the emissions. So we know where the problem lies, and nobody talks about this. And we insist that the only way to growth is to consume more. The classic example for me is vehicles, for instance. I mean, does India really need the vehicle model that the United States follows? I mean, this big carapace on the roads, which is idle 90% of the time. One person in a four-seater or five-seater. We have to question these models, essentially, of consumption, of consumerism, which is rampant. Nobody talks about bringing that down. There's an unstated assumption that the only way to growth is to consume more. Look, I've lived approximately half my life in the US and half my life in India. And I go back and forth quite often. One of the most striking features for me is on trash day, which is usually Wednesday in my neck of the woods, I go out and I see this 45-gallon trash cans. I go to India and it's like barely 12 gallons. And that essentially, to me, identifies a problem. The huge amount of consumption and waste that is generated in the wealthiest countries. And really, that to me, that is the crux of the problem. Population, we know, is eventually going to plateau and come down.
John, interesting where he took us talking about trash. I haven't really thought about that. It took 12 years for global population decline from 7 billion to 8 billion. Can you talk to us about the growth patterns we're seeing, trends, what we'll see moving forward? And to his point, I mean, we're seeing growth rates going like this, but then you see resources going in the opposite direction because of, as he says, overconsumption. Talk to us about, how this ends up being a real critical problem.
Well, if we think about the growth over the last 50 years, the world marked the 4 billion milestone in 1974. So in just under 50 years, we've doubled the size of the global population. And each of those billion increases from 4 to 8 took place in about 12 years of time. So the growth rate has actually been coming down over that time period, but because the population was larger and larger, a lower growth rate was operating on a larger base, and therefore we kind of had a constant, well, not exactly constant, but almost constant. For as long as I can remember, the world has been adding about 80 million people per year, and over 12 years, that gives you almost a billion people, so a billion additional people. And so we've been doing that for the last 50 years, every 12 years adding a billion. As we move forward, though, the growth rate will continue to go down, and it will actually lengthen the time period between successive billions. So the next billion, we think, won't happen until 2037, and the 10 billion will reach in 2058, around there.
Kathleen, I want to get back to just, well, go ahead. You were going to jump in, Chittanon. I want to give you a chance to respond. What were you going to say?
Like I said, so, and then we know that it's going to come down, right? The global population by 2100 is actually projected to be around 8.7 billion. So it's actually coming down. My question really is, what about consumption? Is there any talk of consumption coming down despite the global population coming down? No, nobody talks about consumption. And to me, that is the worrying aspect of this whole crisis.
John, do we need to shift the conversation? Is he right?
Oh, absolutely. I agree completely with what the other speakers have been saying on this point. And I worry many times that the focus on population growth really is distracting us from the real issue, which is how we behave. The total environmental impact is a product of the number of people and the per capita impact of those people. We can't do a lot about the number of people, frankly, and as other speakers have pointed out, we're expecting that it will eventually begin to decline. But consumption continues to go up and up. On a per capita basis, the impact continues to go up. We need to address things in terms of the per capita impact that people are having on the environment and stop worrying as much about how many people there are.
Kathleen, I want to kind of jump on some of the numbers you were just talking about. Population in the United States has slowed down, along with the fertility rate. When you look during the baby boom, World War II, there were about 100 births per 1,000 women of childbearing age. According to the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2021, the number was down to about 56.6%. And I think this kind of gets to what you were talking about education, women's reproductive rights coming into play in all of that. Can you talk about that, but also where we're seeing where there are huge growth numbers, as you were mentioning, where these younger girls are having children in large numbers? How do we kind of shift what we're seeing here in the United States to other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to follow the population trends in the United States and to understand how, in many ways, the slower population growth in the United States can be seen as a sign of progress for women in the United States. I know there's a lot of concern about declining population growth rates in the United States, but just pertinent to the point that Chen was raising, I think because we are some of the highest per capita consumers here in the United States, a slower population growth rate is something that we could be supportive of. And certainly in the ways that it reflects greater autonomy and opportunities for women in their lives, this is something that we can see as a sign of progress. And we would like to extend that kind of progress to women and girls around the world. And I do think that if we are able to double down on our investments in girls' education, in economic opportunities for women, in really truly meaningful access to comprehensive reproductive health care for people around the world, that would have an effect on demographic trends, especially over the long term. I know that for the next couple of decades, population momentum is something that is responsible for the vast amount of population growth that we will see in the next couple of decades. But as we look out over the course of this century, the investments that we're making today that lead to the empowerment and autonomy of people, especially women and girls, is something that could shape the population growth curve toward the end of this century. So I think those are really important investments that we could be making now for people around the world so that we can have this feeling of shared prosperity and greater justice and sustainability for the planet over the long term.
Chen, you were talking about investments to get perhaps couples to start thinking about maybe having more children, but there are all these obstacles, as you pointed out. But China's also facing another problem, which is an aging population. Researchers expect that by 2080, the number of elderly people in China will surpass those of working age. We know that that's a huge problem facing China as we move forward, and of course they're going to have to devote more resources to health and medical services. Can you talk to us about this looming issue that China's also facing that's almost kind of like a runaway train coming from the future to the present?
You're absolutely right. So in addition to the demographic dividends faced by much of the developing countries with more births and higher population growth, China and much of the developed world, including America, we just talked about having a population aging issue and increasingly smaller workforce. A huge working age population will be a boom to the society, but with aging and shrinking workforce, it may damage the economic growth. And we see lots of economic literature showing the lack of innovation, lower economic growth as a result of population aging. And also the society will really face a growing issue of investing in the pension and the retirement system. With fewer young people contribute to the pension system, China is having a very difficult time to invest and in a timely manner to invest in a individual account-based pension system. Otherwise, with the change in the composition of the population, age composition, so the pay-as-you-go system won't be enough. And also the retirement age should be more flexible, not one size fits all, because we know people living longer doesn't mean that they are less healthy. And sometimes work can benefit health. Lots of economics literature about that in different contexts. So how to leverage the healthy aging population to contribute to the society is a big issue. And also for China, it's more hospital-centric system. How to invest in the primary care system to manage those growing aging population with more chronic conditions. That would be the key.
Chen, our colleague Ravinder Bawa talked to a lot of young people in India who are struggling to find work. I want to play her story, but I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's watch.
Nikita is struggling to find a job for more than 6 months. She has a master's degree and the certificates of eligibility to teach. Yet, she is still unemployed. Teaching jobs in India are scarce. Millions of Indians like Nikita are a part of the youth bulge. More than 70% of the population in India is below the age of 35. To reap this unique opportunity, the policy makers will have to think out of the box.
Well, I would say this large young demographic already exists. Whether it's going to be a dividend or a disaster is something that will be determined by the investments that are made by the state in their health, their well-being, opportunities for them.
The UN projects that India's population will rise from the present 1.4 billion people to surpass China next year. It will grow to about 1.7 billion by 2050. India is just beyond the midpoint of its demographic dividend. The government needs to increase the GDP and reduce poverty to make the best of this opportunity. Experts say that the main challenge will be to create jobs for so many.
And the last 8 years is considerably on the point of realization of benefits in terms of new employment creation, upward income mobility of the young, working class. We've lost the ship there. It's just, as I said, it's a point of inflection now. Whatever we choose to do in terms of policy-making decisions will have serious ramifications, not just for the young, but also for the old.
To capitalize on the youth potential, India will have to make a major policy shift from capital-intensive manufacturing to labor-intensive manufacturing. Ravinder Bawa, CGTN, Delhi.
So, Chen, more than 70% of the population in India is said to be below the age of 35. I mean, this has got to be a policymaker's nightmare. What do they do about it?
Well, obviously there is a jobs crisis, right? I mean, they have to create more jobs, and I think the answer was there in your segment that there has to be more labor-intensive manufacturing. One and two. I mean, India's crisis is not just numbers; it's also both education and healthcare. For a while, there was this euphoria that there'd be a demographic dividend because of its population bulge. But I think there's a recognition now that you need a healthy population and an educated population. And then when you have both, there's this whole job crisis. So how does one create jobs? So yeah, I mean, India has its work cut out for it. But to me, there has to be some balance. And when you educate them, what do you educate them with? And I've always said that this American model of consumption is going to be disastrous for India. I mentioned, automobiles and vehicle. I mean, if you imagine a population of 1.4 billion having the same vehicular density in that the United States has, I predicted many years ago that India would have, traffic snarls lasting not hours, but days. I mean, it's just incredible. So we just have to question this fundamental model of consumption. Another area that I've identified and I've long questioned is the permanence of settlements. A classic example is the Kumbh Mela, a big festival in India where 1 million people participate. Do you know that for the Kumbh Mela, the local authorities build a settlement, a city for 10 million people for a month and then dismantle it. So it's possible. And these are all things that, big ticket things that which are cause for global warming. I think we have to question some very, very fundamental things, including the design of the automobile itself.
John, we've just heard from two of our guests here talking about some of the issues facing China and India. What are the biggest challenges for these two countries?
Well, I think it's probably the same challenges being faced by many developing countries, how to grow their economies to create enough jobs for the population, very large youth population, especially in India. China faces a somewhat different set of questions, as pointed out already. Its population is rapidly aging, and there's quite a challenge ahead in terms of the systems by which the different generations support each other. So I don't have a lot to add from what the previous speakers have said. The challenges are fairly clear, and population change is a very important part of that, but it's really only one piece of the story.
Kathleen, I see you nodding your head. We're looking at globally some 700 million people still living in extreme poverty. And, you know, when you look at the African continent with the fertility rates kind of jumping, can you kind of put those two together and tell us what that story tells us?
I'd like to pick up on the point that the previous speakers have been making, and that is that demographic trends do have really significant implications for many of the sustainable development goals that we are trying to achieve. And yet I think demographic literacy among our policymakers and decision makers remains somewhat limited. So I think we all have our work cut out for us in helping to better explain how demographic trends matter for individuals and for communities and for nations and for the world, particularly as we think about trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Poverty alleviation, of course, is a huge part of our global commitments in the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we are seeing persistent rapid population growth in some nations, that makes it extremely difficult to achieve goals, whether that's around poverty alleviation or ending hunger. It can be really difficult with an extremely youthful population. For example, in Niger, half the population is under 15 years old. So half the population doesn't vote. It doesn't participate in kind of that governance of society. And yet that's a population that has some really extreme needs. It's difficult for the government to provide for the needs of an extremely youthful population like that. So it's another reminder that we need to better understand how demographic trends affect our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and also think about the kinds of key investments we can be making today that will shape population trends over time and also contribute to greater sustainability and human rights.
Well, it's been a great conversation. I want to thank all four of you. It was fantastic. Very, very interesting stuff, and we really appreciate it. And that is going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.